So, have you ever been watching Pride and Prejudice and you're just like, why is Mr. Collins inheriting Longbourn? This family has 5 daughters that could use a house and an estate, but instead they're just giving it to this guy that nobody likes. Why? Well, in this video, we're going to be going into this legal concept of entails and how they work in Jane Austen's books and explaining exactly why Mr. Collins is set to inherit. So if you want to learn the answer to that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. So my name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. Okay, so entails seem to sort of be the villain in a lot of Austen books because they have a tendency to take away money from the main heroines and their mothers. So let's take a look at what entails actually were. So if you've seen my video, Does Captain Wentworth by Kellynch, then you're familiar with this concept of primogeniture, or basically the idea that the family's wealth, the main bulk of it needs to be left to the oldest son, or to the next male in the line, sort of skipping over the daughters. So this was a concept. Now, concepts can be great, but they're not usually legally enforceable unless some legal aspect comes into it, and that legal aspect is an entail. It was the legal way that families used to determine who got to inherit the estate next, and also to enforce this concept of primogeniture. Now, here's something I really want to note, which is that entails were legally set up by the family themselves. It wasn't just the English legal system causing the problem in Pride and Prejudice. Sometimes I think people think, oh, it was just English law. Where actually in English law, because the Bennet girls have no brother, if their father died and there was no entail in place, the estate would have been equally divided among the daughters. They would have each had their own equal portion of Longbourn. However, because the family decided to put the entail in place, it's now going to Mr. Collins. So it's actually something the family did to itself. And we're going to talk about exactly who did this to the family in a little bit. Okay, so now we know primogeniture is an idea, entail are the legal means of making it happen. Let's look at this legal means more closely for a second here. So entails protected the estate from 2 issues that could have destroyed it. One is subdivision, such as among Elizabeth and her sisters. The other is waste. So for example, a guy could come in, inherit the estate, game it all away one night while drunk, and then now it's gone. So that's an example of a waste. But entails protected against this by controlling what somebody who inherited the estate could do with it. And this is the first type of inheritor under an entail, which is called a tenant for life. And this is exactly the type of inheritor that Mr. Bennet is in Pride and Prejudice, and also Sir Walter in Persuasion, and also both Henry and John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility are this type of inheritor, where basically a tenant for life only got to live in the house and enjoy the income. But they didn't truly own it like we would think of today. They couldn't sell it, and they couldn't do anything to it that would lower its value. So for example, in Sense and Sensibility, the father of the Dashwood girls is upset that he can't cut down some of the woods on the estate and sell it to make money for his daughter's dowries. Why can't he cut down the woods? Because that would be hurting the estate, it would be lowering its value, and that would be against the entail that is on the estate. So while like we see in Pride and Prejudice, a tenant for life gotta live in the house, they gotta live off the income annually, like Mr. Bennet's £2,000, they gotta walk around the gardens like we see Elizabeth and Jane do, but basically they couldn't hurt the estate, they couldn't sell it, they couldn't mortgage it, and they couldn't determine who would inherit it next because that was already predetermined for them. Now let's look at Sir Walter in Persuasion for a second, because his estate has a situation that was somewhat common at the time, which which is the family, when establishing the entail, left a portion of it out of this protection. He has a small portion of his estate that he can mortgage, that he can sell. Now, families would do this because they understood that their descendants might need to be able to raise money for dowries or something else. So they would leave somewhere between 10 and sometimes even up to 50% out of the entail to give, their offspring some choices in their life. This was usually done in families with larger land ownings because they felt like they could lose some land and still be okay. They're like, okay, we left 10% out. If the kid squanders that, we still own so much land, it's not that big of a deal. So that's what's happening in Persuasion. In fact, here's a quote I sort of referenced in that other video, but let's look at it again here. It said, "There was only a small part of his estate that Sir Walter could dispose of, but had every acre been alienable, it would have made no difference. He had condescended to mortgage as far as he had the power, but he would never condescend to sell. No, he would never disgrace his name so far. The Kellynch estate should be transmitted whole and entire as he had received it." So here we see it talking about that small part of the estate that had been left out of the entail, and he has mortgaged it, but he would never sell it because even though it's not legally bound to go to Mr. Elliot, by his family pride and the concept of primogeniture, in his heart it is. But more important to this topic, that's where that small amount of the estate being mortgaged is coming from. It's that percentage that was left out of the entail. One of you guys were asking in the comments, has he mortgaged the whole Kellynch estate? The answer is no, because as only a tenant for life, he legally couldn't. He only has a small amount of land that he could do that to, and he has, but he won't even sell it. Meanwhile, in Pride and Prejudice, all of Mr. Bennet's estate is included in the entail that's going to pass it to Mr. Collins. Apparently, the family felt like they had no land to spare by leaving it out. So that is the first type of inheritor under an entail, the one that doesn't really own it. The second type of inheritor is called the tenant entail, or as I like to call them, the real inheritor. Because basically, when this person inherits, they really own it for real. Once they're 21 years old and they have, in fact, inherited the estate, they can do whatever they want. They can sell it, they can burn it down, they can leave it to their housekeeper. Basically, it belongs to them and it's no longer under the protections of the entail. Examples of this may, in fact, be Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. He may be one of those real inheritors coming up. Also, there are factors in Persuasion that point to Mr. Elliot being a real inheritor as well. Of course, then the question comes up, okay, then what determines if you are just one of these life tenants or if you're a real inheritor that gets to do whatever you want? And if entails are supposed to be protecting the estate, why would they let anyone become a real inheritor? Because they could again squander it if they wanted to. And that goes back to English history and the history of entails. So way back in the day, Middle Ages, entails could go on forever. They were entails in perpetuity, basically perpetually, just generation after generation after generation. Everyone was like Mr. Bennet. They were just this tenant for life. They couldn't break up the estate. They couldn't sell it. But basically that eventually got old and owners were like, you know what? I don't like the fact that we never get to essentially control the things we own. So a few hundred years before Jane Austen's time, it became a legal precedent that you could not have an entail that lasted forever. And so families were like, yay, great, the entails don't get to last forever. But then they were like, we still need to protect our estates though, so what do we do? By Jane Austen's time, it had pretty much evolved into this instead, which is an entail would last a certain number of generations, and then it would end on a real inheritor. And it would have to end on a real inheritor. It would have to end. Remember, it can't last forever. And that number of generations was generations currently alive plus one unborn. So for example, if you were the grandfather of a family, you would establish an entail. You could say, this estate will pass to my son, and then it will pass to my grandson. Because they're both living, those are generations living. Then you could specify one yet to be born. So you could say, my son, my grandson, and my grandson's unborn son. So there's that unborn generation. So that last person in the entail would be the for real inheritor because it has to end at that point. Basically, what would happen is a family would establish an entail like this. It would go through the generations listed, and then it would run out. And then they would have to renew it, and then it would last however many generations are listed. It would run out, they would renew it, it would last. So basically, it was something that they were renewing every few generations, or as we'll talk about in a minute, every generation. Yeah, lots of legal stuff going on there. And of course, a very important legal provision in every entail was the requirement to like this video. It very specifically stated, you have to like Ellie Dashwood's video. Otherwise, the entail will be sad. I really do appreciate it so much when you guys like my videos. That's because you're awesome. I have the most awesome community ever. Thank you for being awesome. But also back to entails. Now, the way a family would go about establishing this entail is through a legal document called a strict settlement. And so a strict settlement would be drawn up every so many generations. And one of you guys were asking in the comments the other day about, was Jane Austen essentially wrong for using the word entail in Pride and Prejudice versus the term strict settlement? And the answer is no, she really wasn't, because both legal professionals in the 1800s called what strict settlements created entails, and modern day economic historians also call them entails. So Jane Austen was, of course, like she usually is on most things, accurate in her use of the term entails in Pride and Prejudice. So we see a perfect example of a entail being set up for several generations at the very beginning of Sense and Sensibility. So in chapter 1 of Sense and Sensibility, so much death happens, guys. In fact, first the Dashwood sisters' great uncle dies, and then their father dies. But it's really their great uncle's death and his will that creates this entail on the estate that causes a lot of the financial problems of the story. So let's look at that quote. So starting with the great uncle's death there, it says, "The old gentleman died, his will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew. But he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son. But to his son and his son's son, a child of 4 years old, it was secured in such a way as to leave to himself no power of providing for those who were most dear to him, and the most needed by a provision by any charge on the estate or by any sale of its valuable woods. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child." Okay, so in this quote, we see so much like we've been talking about. So first off, we see this entail established for the generations currently living. The great uncle dies, he leaves it to his nephew, and then he leaves it to his nephew's son, and then he leaves it to his nephew's grandson, who are all currently alive. Technically, he could have also specified his nephew's grandson's unborn child, but for some reason he didn't. But again, as we see, families can customize their own entail when they set it up. We also see the father of Eleanor and Marianne and Margaret regretting the fact that he's only a tenant for life because he can't mortgage any of this estate, he can't sell any of its woods, and thereby he can't provide financially for his family like he was planning to do. He was planning, if he was named the tenant for real, to do some of these things to raise money for his daughters and his wife, but that doesn't happen because he's made only a tenant for life. Of course, once he inherited, he could have started saving part of his annual income to provide for his daughters. However, he died so shortly after inheriting, he really wasn't able to do that either. But let's talk about someone who inherited a long time ago and was still not that great at saving for his daughter's dowries. Like I talk about in my video, are the Bennets poor? Okay, so Mr. Bennet. Let's talk about the entail on his estate. This first quote lays it out pretty clearly. It says, "Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of 2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed in default of heirs male on a distant relation." That's correct. It is entailed on a distant relation, also known as Mr. Collins. With that lack of heirs male, we do see it doing this basic preference for the male line and primogeniture there. Now, here's a big question, which is, who was it that made Mr. Collins inherit? We see in Sense and Sensibility, it was that great uncle when he died that left it away from the Dashwood sisters. So who was it that is preventing Elizabeth and her sisters from inheriting by signing that strict settlement that created this entail that is now resulting in Mr. Collins inheriting? And the answer to that question is actually super ironic. And let's look at something Mrs. Bennet has to say about the entail to get a hint of who it was. She says, "I never can be thankful, Mr. Bennet, for anything about the entail. How anyone could have the conscience to entail away in an estate from one's own daughters, I cannot understand. And all for the sake of Mr. Collins, too. Why should he have it more than anybody else?" So it's very interesting the way that Mrs. Bennet says one's own daughters. More than likely, it was Mr. Bennet himself who signed the strict settlement that created the entail that is now leaving Elizabeth and her sisters out of inheriting Longbourn. Because let's talk about one of the most common ways these entails were renewed in a generation. And to help us understand that, here is another quote from Pride and Prejudice about the entail. "When first Mr. Bennet had married, economy was held to be perfectly useless. For, of course, they were to have a son. The son was to join in cutting off the entail as soon as he should be of age, and the widow and younger children would by that means be provided for." Okay, so it's talking about the fact that young Mr. Bennet thought he was going to have a son, and that son would be the for real inheritor. What's interesting is once that son turned 21 years old, he and his father could agree to do something called breaking the entail. They could join together and legally say, okay, this entail is no longer legally binding. Since we're pretty much the parties who have a legal interest in it, we can end it. We can cut it off. Now, what families would do is they would have the son join with the father, cut off the entail. And this would help them do a few different things. Like in this quote, we see that it would have allowed Mr. Bennet to possibly sell some of the land, mortgage it, or do something else that would allow him to provide for Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters. The other thing families would do when they would have the son break off the entail is that is also how they could have him reestablish it. Because if the father simply waited to die, his son would be the next for real inheritor. And again, that son might squander everything. So what they would want to do is they would want to have this son, who's going to be the for real inheritor, reestablish the entail before he inherited, which would make him now a tenant for life and make his unborn child the next for real inheritor, thereby extending another generation of protection for the estate. But the thing is that Mr. Bennet doesn't have this son. He has no son to help him break the entail, provide for his sisters, and help him reestablish it. But this does give us a good example of what probably happened to young Mr. Bennet himself. Okay, so you might be saying, why would this son, who's going to be a for real inheritor, reestablish an entail while his father is still alive that makes him also only a tenant for life? That doesn't seem very smart. Wouldn't he want to protect his for real status? And the answer is, first of all, children tended to be more obedient to their parents back in the day. So if a father was like, "You're signing the strict settlement, son," he's like, "Okay, dad." In fact, one of the most notable examples of someone who tried on principle to reject his father's request for him to reestablish the entail was Percy Shelley, the famous poet who really, in my opinion, has no claim to the moral high ground on any topic. Yeah. What was with the poets in this era just being just like really awful guys? I don't know. Anyway, when his dad wanted him to reestablish the entail, he was like, "I'm morally opposed to this." And then his dad was like, "Really? You are? Well, I guess you're also morally opposed to getting your allowance then." Because remember, oldest sons were generally dependent on their fathers for having an allowance that allowed them not only to live, but also to get married and support a wife. And if the guy controlling your income is like, hey, here, sign the entail for the next generation, most people signed it. Percy Shelley tried not to, and he held out. He got in a lot of debt, and then he ended up signing it anyway because he's like, okay, I kind of ran out of money now on many levels. I guess I'm signing the entail. Yeah, that's the story of Percy Shelley. So much stuff. So these fathers were controlling their sons' allowances, which would be one strong motivation for them to sign it on top of filial duty. Another common reason was also connected again to the father controlling the purse strings, but in connection to marriage. So let's imagine a young Mr. Bennet. He's met this very pretty Miss Gardiner. She's so young and pretty, and she seems good-humored, and he just needs to marry her. And so he goes home to his dad, and he's like, hey, I met this girl. I want to marry her, but clearly I'm going to need more money to do that. And his dad's like, yeah, sure, great. That sounds awesome, son. But, marriage is a pretty big step. You might be having children of your own soon. It would be a great time for us to sign a new strict settlement, establishing an entail for the next generation. And Mr. Bennet's like, really, Dad? Do I have to? And he's like, do you want me to give you more money so you can get married? And he's like, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I'll sign it. I'm gonna have a son anyway, so why does it matter? He'll just help me break the entail later. Except for the fact that Mr. Bennet never has a son, he only has 5 daughters, and Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters are left out of the inheritance because her father signed that strict settlement in his youth. Now, can we be 100% absolutely sure that it was Mr. Bennet that signed the strict settlement creating this entail? No, but there are good indications that it was, and it would have gone along with common practice at the time. Now, when talking about common practice, was every estate under an entail? The answer is no. But by the end of the 1800s, it was estimated that at least 50 to 75% of the land in the United Kingdom was. So it definitely was a common practice, and that's one of the reasons it is such a common practice across Jane Austen's novels. Another question is, was every entail only along the male line? The answer is no. There were plenty of female heiresses that were set to inherit. One of them in Pride and Prejudice is Anne de Bourgh, Lady Catherine's daughter. In fact, let's look at a quote from Lady Catherine about this. She's talking to Elizabeth Bennet, and Charlotte Lucas is right there. And this is what she says. Your father's estate is entailed on Mr. Collins, I think. For your sake, turning to Charlotte, I am glad of it. But otherwise, I see no occasion for entailing estates from the female line. It was not thought necessary in Sir Louis de Bourgh's family. Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet? Ah, Lady Catherine, just like rubbing salt in other people's wounds. But basically, the estate at Rosings is not entailed away from the female line, so it can go to Anne de Bourgh. What's interesting about that quote is the estate could still be entailed, but it could include the female line. And in fact, there were so many different ways for families to customize the way estates were inherited, but in this video, we've been covering a pretty basic and also very common way it was done, and something, of course, as I've pointed out, we see across Jane Austen's works. So basically, just to sum all of this up, entails were protecting the estates. There was 2 different types of people who could inherit. The ones who couldn't hurt the estate at all, the ones who could if they wanted to. They could only last for so many generations, and Mr. Bennet could have very well signed the strict settlement that created the entail that is leaving the estate to Mr. Collins. So much stuff. Meanwhile, Anne de Bourgh has nothing to worry about, as Lady Catherine points out. I hope this has helped you understand why Mr. Collins is inheriting Longbourn. Let me know in the comments below, if you were a parent, would you make your son sign a strict settlement creating an entail that could possibly leave your granddaughters out in the cold? Let me know in the comments down below. And keep having an awesome day, because you're awesome. Bye! Why is my voice so raspy? My voice is so raspy, guys. I've been talking forever. Now I'm just making weird noises. Okay,